A man walks into a boutique and tries on a watch that costs more than his first car. The lights are perfect. The mirror is perfect. The salesperson says almost nothing because the watch is supposed to speak for itself. He lifts his wrist, turns it slightly, and for 1 second he does not see steel, sapphire, a dial, a bracelet, and a movement. He sees success. He sees taste. He sees the version of himself that other men are supposed to respect. But then you open the case back, you compare the movement. You look at the bracelet, you check the finishing under real light, you look at the secondary market, you ask what this watch actually costs. Not emotionally, but mechanically. And suddenly the image changes. He did not just buy a watch, he bought the advertising campaign, he bought the boutique rent.
He bought the celebrity ambassador. He bought the recycled heritage story. He bought the privilege of wearing a name that strangers recognize from across a dinner table.
The problem is not buying an expensive watch. The problem is buying a common watch dressed like luxury. So in this video, we are going through 7 overpriced watch brands men keep buying, and then 4 hidden gems that often deliver more watch, more construction, more identity, and more value for the money. And the question behind every single one is simple. Does this watch cost more because it is better, or because men have been trained to recognize the name on the dial? The first brand is Rolex, and before anyone panics, no, Rolex is not a bad watchmaker. That is the trap. Rolex makes excellent watches. The cases are strong, the bracelets are some of the best in the business, the movements are robust, accurate, and built for long service lives. The designs are clean because they were refined slowly over decades instead of reinvented every season. But many men are not paying only for that. They are paying for the crown. They are paying for the social shortcut. They are paying for the one watch that even people who know nothing about watches still understand. And that is where value starts to separate from status. At retail, a Rolex can make sense depending on the model, the buyer, and the long-term plan. But the modern problem is that many men do not actually buy Rolex at retail. They buy it through the secondary market.
After the hype machine has already done its work. The watch has one price in the catalog. Then it has another price in the real world.
And sometimes the gap between those two numbers is not engineering. It is scarcity. It is waiting lists. It is dealer games. It is Instagram. It is the belief that if you do not buy it now, someone else will, and the price will run away from you forever. That is how a tool watch becomes a financial product. That is how a steel sports watch becomes a test of access.
And that is how a man convinces himself he is making a smart purchase when he may simply be arriving late to someone else's trade.
You are not wrong for wanting the Submariner. You are not wrong for admiring the Datejust. You are not wrong for understanding why the GMT Master became an icon. But you have to be honest about what you are buying. If you pay a premium over retail because you want the feeling now, that premium is not for better finishing. It is not for a better movement. It is not for more steel. It is for immediate validation. And validation is the most expensive complication in watchmaking. The second brand is Armani Exchange. And really, this block represents the entire category of fashion watches. Sold as if they were watchmaking. Armani Exchange, Michael Kors, Hugo Boss, Tommy Hilfiger, Diesel. Different names, same trap. A man walks into a department store. He sees a brand he already associates with clothing, fragrance, nightlife, fitted shirts, black bags, polished shoes, and a certain version of urban sophistication. Then he sees the watch. It is large. It is shiny. The dial has texture, the logo is familiar, the box looks giftable. The price is high enough to feel serious, but not high enough to force research. So he buys it. He thinks he bought taste. But most of the time, he bought licensing. That means the fashion house is not necessarily sitting in a workshop obsessing over movements, case tolerances, water resistance, servicing, or dial finishing. In many cases, the brand name is licensed to a company that produces watches under that label. The result is a product that looks like lifestyle first and watch second. Often you get a basic quartz movement, a generic case, a bracelet that looks impressive under store lighting but feels hollow when you compare it with a real watch bracelet, a mineral crystal instead of sapphire, a dial designed to look expensive from 5 feet away, not to reward inspection up close. And the worst part is not that quartz is bad. Quartz can be excellent. The problem is paying designer brand pricing for a product where the real value is the logo on the dial.
Not the watch underneath it. Try reselling one. That is when the illusion breaks. The same watch that felt sophisticated in the mall becomes almost invisible on the used market.
Not because it stopped telling time, but because there was never much horological demand behind it. Nobody is hunting for the movement.
Nobody is studying the reference. Nobody is asking about the lug-to-lug measurement. They are just seeing a fashion accessory from a previous season. A fashion watch is not always evil. It can be fine if you know exactly what it is and pay accordingly. But if you buy it because the clothing brand feels upscale, you are making the most common beginner mistake in watches. You are confusing a logo that dresses the body with a company that knows how to build the wrist. The third brand is Hublot.
Hublot is the brand that turned visual aggression into a business model. Big case, big screws, big rubber strap, big celebrity presence, big statement.
And for a certain buyer, that is the entire point. A Hublot does not whisper. It enters the room before you do. It wants to be noticed from the valet stand, the nightclub booth, the private lounge, the luxury car interior, the wrist shot. But here is the problem. Presence is not the same thing as refinement. A watch can be loud and still not be deep. A watch can be heavy
And still not feel beautifully engineered. A watch can look expensive and still deliver less proportional value than its price suggests.
Hublot's defenders will point out that the brand has done real material experimentation: ceramic, sapphire cases, carbon, colored composites, wild limited editions.
That is true. The brand is not empty. It knows exactly what it is doing. But the question is not whether Hublot can make a bold object. The question is whether many men are paying watchmaking prices for design theater. Because a lot of Hublot's appeal lives in the flex. The recognizable case shape, the celebrity connection, the feeling that the watch belongs to a world of athletes, rappers, entrepreneurs, supercars, and champagne lighting. And that creates a dangerous buying environment. When a watch is designed to look expensive instantly, you may stop asking slower questions.
How refined is the finishing? How special is the movement relative to the price? How well does the case wear after the first adrenaline rush fades?
How much of this design language is original and how much of it is engineered for maximum wrist impact? Then there is depreciation.
Many loud luxury watches suffer when the buyer leaves the boutique and tries to sell into the real market.
The second buyer is not standing under the same lights. The second buyer is not being served espresso. The second buyer is comparing listings. That is when hype becomes a number. And sometimes the number is brutal. Hublot is not for everyone, and that is part of its appeal. But if you buy one because it looks like power, remember this. Power in watchmaking is not volume. Sometimes the loudest watch in the room is also the one working hardest to justify itself. The fourth brand is Tag Heuer. And this is where the conversation becomes more complicated, because Tag Heuer has real history, motorsport history, chronograph history, the Monaco, the actual icons, actual design language, actual reasons collectors care. But a brand can have real history and still sell certain watches at prices where the value equation starts to strain. This is the danger of the comfortable middle. Tag Heuer is often the first real luxury watch for a lot of men. It sits in that zone where the brand is recognizable, the boutique experience feels premium, and the price is high enough to feel like you have entered the club.
But when you start comparing specs, things get interesting. You look at the movement, you look at the bracelet, you look at the case thickness.
You look at the clasp, you look at the dial finishing, you look at alternatives from brands that are less famous but more aggressive on build quality, and suddenly the Tag is not always the obvious winner. Again, this does not mean every Tag Heuer is overpriced. Some models are genuinely desirable.
Some designs are classics for a reason. The Monaco is not pretending to be something else. The Carrera, when done right, still has a sharp identity.
But the buyer has to be careful, because Tag's name does a lot of work. It tells your brain this is sporty, Swiss, masculine, heritage-driven.
Not in a vintage advertisement, not in a racing photograph, not in the memory of a better-priced era. The question is simple.
If this same exact case, movement, bracelet, and dial had an unknown logo on it, would you still pay the same price? That question is uncomfortable. That is why it works. The fifth brand is Breitling. And before the Breitling fans reload, understand the point. Breitling makes serious watches. The Navitimer is a real icon. The brand has deep aviation associations. But Breitling also shows how heritage can become a fog machine. Aviation, instruments, pilots, professionals, chronographers. They make a man feel like he is not just buying a watch. He is buying a tool with a mission, even if his main mission is answering emails and driving to dinner. That is the magic of tool watch marketing. It takes professional language and sells it to civilian life. And there is nothing wrong with that, as long as the watch gives back enough substance.
The issue is that not every model with a heritage story automatically becomes a great buy. Not every pilot-inspired dial is an instrument.
Not every oversized case feels purposeful. Not every limited edition carries real importance. Not every vintage reference needs to be reborn at a premium.
Breitling has improved a lot in recent years by refining sizing, cleaning up designs, and leaning into more tasteful heritage pieces.
But the buyer still has to separate the great watches from the watches that simply wear a costume. When a dial is busy,
Ask if it is useful or just theatrical. When a case is large, ask if it supports function or just wrist dominance. When the marketing says professional, ask professional for whom? Because the original pilot did not buy a watch to impress another pilot at brunch.
he needed legibility, timing, reliability, a tool. That is the line. Heritage is valuable when it explains the design.
The sixth brand is Bremont. Bremont is interesting because it does not fit the lazy definition of a bad brand.
The company built a strong identity around British aviation, military associations, durability, and adventure.
Limited editions, rugged cases, patriotic storytelling, mechanical romance. And for many buyers, compelling.
Especially when the buyer does not slot down and compare the watch against what else exists at the same price.
With Bremont, the trap is not that every watch is poor. The trap is that the emotional packaging can become stronger than the value equation. You are not just shown a watch. You are shown a narrative of courage, engineering, military connection, and British resilience.
And that can make the price feel justified before the product has been examined. But a watch still has to answer the same boring questions. What movement is inside? How much has it been modified? How good is the case finishing? How original is the design? How transparent is the manufacturing story?
How does the bracelet or strap compare with competitors? What happens to the price after purchase? That last one matters.
Because if a watch relies heavily on a niche story, the resale market can be thin. The perfect buyer has to understand the narrative, want the aesthetic, accept the price, and believe in the brand. That is a narrower exit door. Bremont shows a modern truth about watches. A small or independent brand is not automatically better than a big brand. Sometimes the big brand sells corporate luxury.
And sometimes the smaller brand sells boutique mythology. Both can cost you. The question is not whether the story is cool. The question is whether the watch still makes sense when the story goes silent. The seventh brand is Audemars Piguet.
More specifically, the hype-driven side of Audemars Piguet. And yes, Audemars Piguet is one of the great names in high-end watchmaking. The royal oak is historically important.
The finishing, especially on the right pieces, can be exceptional.
The brand belongs in serious conversations. But that is exactly why the investment trap is so dangerous. Because when a brand has real prestige, men become willing to excuse irrational prices.
They tell themselves they are not spending, they are allocating. They are not buying jewelry, they are entering an asset class.
They are not chasing hype. They are making a disciplined move. Then you look closer. Certain models explode because of scarcity, celebrity risks, social media,
Color trends, waitlist culture, and the feeling that the train is leaving the station. People start talking about watches like stocks. They say discontinued, limited, allocation, blue dial, green dial, jumbo, offshore, collaboration, future classic. The villain is the man who buys a watch he does not understand because he thinks it will make him financially sophisticated. A watch can hold value. This is the most dangerous sentence in luxury watches. It will probably keep going up. Maybe it will. Maybe it will not.
But if your entire purchase only makes sense because the next man will pay more, you are no longer buying a watch. You are buying a belief about another man's future desire. And that desire can disappear. Markets change, tastes change, interest rates change. Collectors rotate. The watch that felt impossible to get can suddenly sit longer than expected. The hot reference becomes yesterday's chart. The gray market premium compresses.
The limited edition is not as limited in demand as it was in supply. Audemars Piguet is not the villain. The villain is the man who buys a watch he does not understand because he thinks it will make him financially sophisticated. A watch can hold value.
A watch can even rise. But a watch is not automatically an investment because a salesman, a forum, or an influencer said the magic words.
If you would not love the watch at a loss, you probably should not buy it for a gain. That is the turn. Because after 7 ways men overpay, the solution is not to hate watches. The solution is to stop buying applause. A good watch does not need to impress everyone. It needs to reward the person wearing it. So now we move from the logo to the movement.
From the boutique to the wrist. From brands that train you to want recognition to brands that often deliver more watch for the money.
The first hidden gem is sin. Sin is what happens when a watch feels designed by people who care more about function than seduction.
There is very little fantasy in the best sin watches, and that is the fantasy. The 556 is clean, compact, legible, and serious.
The 104 gives you pilot watch utility without turning your wrist into a billboard. The more technical sin models lean into case hardening, moisture protection, magnetic resistance, and tool watch engineering in a way that feels genuinely connected to purpose. Sin does not usually give you the nightclub version of masculinity. It gives you the workshop version, the cockpit version, the version that says the watch should be readable at a glance, durable in use, and honest about what it is.
Compare that to a loud sports watch that costs more because it has a famous logo, oversized case, and celebrity aura.
With sin, you are often paying for clarity. You see it in the dial layout, you feel it in the case shape. You notice it in the way the watch refuses to beg for attention. That restraint is rare. A sin does not make a stranger think you are rich. It makes a watch person think you are paying attention. And that difference matters.
Because the best purchases are often not the ones that generate the most immediate compliments. They are the ones that still feel right after the attention fades.
Sin is the alternative for the man who wanted presence, then realized presence does not have to be shiny. Sometimes the strongest watch is the one that does not perform strength at all. The second hidden gem is Oris. Oris is not unknown to watch people, but it is still underestimated by men who shop mainly through status. Because Oris often gives you Swiss mechanical credibility without asking the logo to do all the emotional work. The Aquis does not need to pretend to be a Submariner. It has its own case, its own bracelet integration, its own dial attitude.
The Diver 65 does vintage without feeling like a museum gift shop. The Big Crown pointer date has a shape, a charm, and a function that immediately feels Oris.
That matters because originality is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a bezel shape, a bracelet link, a hand, a proportion. Oris often feels approachable without feeling disposable. It feels friendly without feeling cheap. And most importantly, the price often still feels connected to the product, not just the mythology around the product.
You get Swiss mechanical credibility, you get designs with character, you get divers, pilots, and everyday pieces that feel like choices, not compromises.
And because Oris is independent, the brand story feels different from the large luxury groups that position watches like steps on a corporate ladder.
That does not mean every Oris is a steal. You still compare the movement, the thickness, the bracelet, and the discount. But Oris is one of the rare brands where the conversation often starts with the watch instead of the social position. For the man who almost bought the safer, famous name, Oris can feel like the first independent decision.
The third hidden gem is Formex. Formex represents the modern buyer's revenge, because today, a watch brand cannot hide behind romance as easily as before.
The specs are public, the comparisons are immediate, the customer knows what micro-adjustment is, he knows what a Celita movement is. Formex understands that the modern buyer can compare finishing, clasps, bracelets, movements, and case construction in minutes. So the watch has to show its work, the bracelet has to articulate, the clasp has to adjust, the case has to wear well.
The dial cannot survive on romance alone.
It has to survive macro photography, owner forums, and direct comparison.
That does not mean Formex has the emotional weight of a century-old Swiss name. It does not. But that is exactly why it is interesting.
You are not paying a huge heritage tax. You are asking a direct question. What do I physically receive for this money?
That question makes old luxury uncomfortable because old luxury often wants you to feel before you measure.
Formex is interesting because it seems built for the buyer who already knows the vocabulary and wants the object to answer back. He does not need marble walls, champagne, and a century of myth to feel comfortable with the purchase. Formex is not selling him a fantasy of European aristocracy or vintage racing dust. It is selling him a well-specified modern watch.
That sounds less romantic, but it can be much more satisfying, because when the honeymoon ends, specifications remain.
A brand like this will not impress everyone at dinner, but it may impress you every time you adjust the bracelet. It may not give you inherited prestige. It gives you daily usefulness, modern construction, and fewer excuses.
And in a market full of excuses, fewer excuses can feel like luxury. The fourth hidden gem is Christopher Ward. And this is the one many men ignored for too long. Because for years, Christopher Ward had a reputation problem that was not really about the watches.
It was about prestige. The name did not sound like a Swiss dynasty. The brand did not have a marble boutique on the best street in town.
For a long time, some buyers could not get past the idea that serious watches had to sound older, Swiss, and aristocratic.
Christopher Ward challenged that by asking a blunt question. What if you removed the boutique theatre and put more money into the watch?
That question produced watches that became harder and harder to dismiss. The cases improved, the bracelets improved, the designs sharpened.
The cylinder gave buyers a clean, everyday option, without pretending to be more exotic than it was.
And the Bel Canto changed the conversation completely, because suddenly the brand was not only competing on value, it was competing on imagination. That is rare.
The 12 pushed into integrated bracelet territory with real confidence. The divers gave buyers strong specifications without requiring luxury group permission. The brand became a problem for lazy prestige thinking, because once you compare the object, the old excuses get weaker.
That is why Christopher Ward makes some expensive brands uncomfortable. It forces the obvious questions. Why did the famous Swiss watch cost twice as much? Why is this clasp better? Why does this dial feel more alive?
Why does the bracelet articulate better? Why did I think prestige automatically meant quality? That is when the spell breaks. Christopher Ward is not perfect. No hidden gem is. You still have to ask whether the design speaks to you.
You still have to ask whether the name, the service network, the resale, and the proportions make sense for your life.
But the lesson is larger than any one brand. Stop asking watches to prove your taste to strangers.
Do not ask first if the brand is famous. Ask what you are receiving. Look at the movement. Look at the case.
Look at the bracelet, look at the clasp, look at the dial, look at the finishing, look at the serviceability, look at the resale honestly, not emotionally.
If the watch only works when someone recognizes it, the watch may not be doing the real work.
A better question is this: would you still enjoy the watch alone, in normal light, after the buying rush is gone?
That is the question that protects you from both cheap mistakes and expensive mistakes. A Rolex at the right price can be brilliant. A Tag Heuer in the right model can be meaningful. A Breitling with the right proportions can be fantastic.
Even a Loud Hublot can be the right watch for the right person if he knows exactly what he is buying.
But none of that changes the central point. The right watch is not the one that wins the brand argument. The right watch is the one where the story, the construction, the price, and your actual life line up. That is not always the most famous watch. It is not always the cheapest watch. It is usually the clearest watch. It comes from knowing what matters when nobody else notices. The movement behind the dial, the finishing on the edge, the way the bracelet drapes, the way the clasp closes, the honesty of the design, the distance between price and product. That is where value lives. This is what separates a buyer from a consumer. A consumer asks what the watch says about him. A buyer asks what the watch gives back after the mirror goes away, after the compliments fade, after the receipt is old. That is why some men overpay. Not because they are stupid, but because they are human.
When they want permission to spend too much. Because the goal is not to buy cheap watches. The goal is to buy clearly. A good watch should not need a famous name to survive inspection. And a famous name should not be allowed to hide an ordinary watch.